The following message is copyrighted by Westminster Theological Seminary. Duplication, distribution, or other use of all or any part of this message is not permitted without prior written consent. Please direct your inquiries to communications@wts.edu. For all other information, please visit the main website at www.wts.edu.
We're going to be talking this afternoon about the whole issue of counseling and personal problems and psychotherapy and personality theories and that sort of thing. Now, if you've ever been in a library, you'll realize that there are literally hundreds of yards in a big research library on this topic. So here we have one brief hour to talk about things that have vexed the entirety of the 20th century. So grant me the grace of knowing that we're going to paint with not just a big brush, but a roller, paint in massive, broad strokes here. Let me just say one personal word. I've got an extended outline here, but let me say a personal word as I before we get into this. I came to Christ in a context of being, I would say, a true believer.
This is the end of this message. This series continues on the next cassette. This tape has been produced by Westminster Media. All rights reserved.
To be helpful to people, that those things essentially were offered by the secular mental health professions, and I was going to be part of that, and was actually converted to Christ while working in a psychiatric hospital in my own intent, planning to go on in clinical psychology and become a doctoral student there, and then radically rerouted by first at the most fundamental level personally, rerouted to come to know the living God, and then as that worked out, as I came to understand the implications of thinking in a coherent, presuppositionally consistent way about the Christian faith, realizing that we as Christians have a whole better, more profound, more insightful way of looking at the nature of people and their problems and at the sorts of solutions. So I come at this issue not just as in a sense that it's of theoretical interest, but one that I'm convinced both personally as well as in looking at forces in our culture, these issues are big, they're important. So I want to talk about the relationship between a biblically consistent Christianity and the modern psychologies. And now let me qualify that last word for a second. When I say psychologies, in no way are we critiquing the notion of psychology in general, the sense of, that we have a soul, and that soul there's thoughts and there's emotions, there's volitions, there's things going on. Every one of us ought to be a psychologist in the best sense of the word. It's simply a way of saying we ought to study the soul. We ought to know people. We ought to know what makes people tick. What we're critiquing are the organized systems, the different interpretations that have been placed on the human soul, the personality theories, the psychotherapies, which are ways of taking those theories, and you might almost say bringing to bear pastoral ministry to communicate a certain vision of what is true about persons. Those are the things where biblical Christianity, in a certain sense, has a superior psychology, a superior psychotherapy, one that subjects the competitors to a radical critique. But that's prelude of things to come. Let's jump in. I'm going to move in two basic directions here. Initially, as you see the heading there, considering our historical moment, make some comments, more historical comments, and then secondly, moving to how do we engage our moment with the resources of a presuppositionally consistent Christianity. So let's jump in on the historical moment. Number one, right on the surface of it, Christianity has a self-conscious competitor. Self-proclaimed competitor has arrived on the stage in the 20th century and said basically that the resources of the Christian faith have run out of gas. They are no longer compelling to modern human beings. They no longer answer or address the needs and struggles of life lived, and that what is needed is a different vision, a different scripture, if you will, a different truth, and a different pastorate, a different set of people to cure souls. It's not as though, say, a place like Westminster, which is very concerned to think biblically, it's not as though we are simply just being reactive or feisty or wanting to be argumentative. The assault has come in the first place from the other side, and in a very self-conscious way. And I've given you some representative quotations here that we could have picked 100 others. These happen to be particularly to the point. Sigmund Freud, in the first place. The word secular pastoral worker might well serve as a general formula for describing the function which the analyst, whether he is doctor or a layman, has to perform in his relation to the public. You see what Freud's saying there? That our function is fundamentally a pastoral worker. And you notice how Freud, and this is one of the places where Freud's followers have really ditched a key part of his vision. Freud put no stress at all that a doctor needed to do psychoanalysis. Anyone could. In fact, one of his leading disciples, Erik Erikson, was an artist. He was not a doctor at all. Freud was essentially saying that the role of a psychotherapist is a pastoral worker, a secular one, because we now live in an age in which God is no longer credible, post-Enlightenment sort of age, and yet people still have the same problems which we would denominate sin and misery that they've always had. Somebody has to do the pastoral work to cure souls. For the second, Carl Jung, initially a disciple of Freud, then broke away. Patients force the psychotherapist into the role of a priest and expect and demand of him that he shall free them from their distress. That is why we psychotherapists must occupy ourselves with problems which, strictly speaking, belong to the theologian. Here's Carl Jung, modern man in search of a soul, again frankly stating the old truths of Christianity no longer carry the freight, and that there's a vacuum of meaning in the modern world, a spiritual vacuum, and the psychotherapist is the one who is now designated to provide meaning, freedom from distress, and so forth. A form of spirituality even that is a, from our point of view as Christians, a godless, Christless, spiritless, wordless spirituality. Abraham Maslow, Humanistic Psychology. This is the opening salvo of Toward a Psychology of Being, Maslow's greatest book. Human nature seems not to be intrinsically or primarily or necessarily evil. Now that's straight in our faces, isn't it? You know, who is he talking to here? He's talking to you. He's talking to me. He's talking to Ecclesiastes 9:3 that says that the hearts of the sons of men are full of evil, and there is madness in their hearts while they live, and then they die. That very bleak description of human nature in its fallenness, that where Christians have said that there is an inertial drift towards what the Scriptures call sin, an inertial drift away from God. And we would say even that the very theories that are here are affected in their theory building by that inertial drift away from God. Maslow comes right out and says, no, this isn't true. Or here's B.F. Skinner in his utopian novel. What Jesus offered in return for loving one's enemies was heaven on earth, better known as peace of mind. Well, you could have fooled me. Now, we'd certainly say peace of mind is a byproduct of what Jesus offers, but the Jesus that we believe in was not just simply offering a technology, a set of tricks that make you a relaxed, confident human being, was he? B.F. Skinner thinks that there's a technology that will address the human dilemma. And he can arrange the contingencies of reinforcement in such a way that we can create contented, happy, productive, adjusted people. Right in our face. And the whole structure of Walden 2 is an alternative church, an alternative Savior, an alternative gospel. Or here's a little more contemporary. Pop psychologist John Bradshaw. If you watch any channel 12, PBS, Bradshaw is the guru. Whenever they do fundraisers, they have Bradshaw Days because he is the hottest program they have ever run here over the last 7-8 years. And what does John Bradshaw say? Comes at us as a psychologist, but he is a religionist, isn't he? Jesus calls us to creativity and our own unique I amness. Today I know at the deepest level that I am I, a wondrous person. I'm essentially an I am inside, and then brutal life experiences, being persecuted or abused or misunderstood or mistreated, have somehow poisoned that wonderful I amness that I am by nature. And my goal is then to get back in touch with my I amness and to actualize that. And this is not the sort of neutral science out there studying the world. These are religionists in a very self-conscious way. In sum, psychotherapists are secular priests. It's the phrase from Perry London, a very influential commentator on modern psychotherapy. historian and commentator. And the more self-conscious freely acknowledge this role. The next sentence is more mine. More pointedly, they are secular prophet theologians. They are people giving a meaning to life, explaining life, making sense of life. They are secular priest pastors, shepherding the human soul. They are secular king elders, administering the institutions of the cure of souls, administering the mental health centers, the counseling offices, the psychiatric hospitals, and so forth. Given the stated intentions of 20th century psychologists, one would expect that the church would rise up and there would be conflict. There would be that in the very first place there would be a conflict between biblical Christianity and people who are saying of themselves, we will replace you, we will bury you. 3 levels of conflict. Question of truth, question of love, the question of power. Who is right? Who is right in their diagnosis of the human condition? Is it true that human beings are not primarily evil, but are fundamentally, to follow Maslow out, the ruination of our souls and the sin and misery of our lives is a product of unmet needs, that we are somehow trampled on by forces outside of us. Therefore, whatever is evil is only a product of what happened to me. Is that true? Or is the Christian vision true? We would expect a fundamental conflict in the understanding of people and their problems. Second area of conflict. Who has the right to work with people? Who has the call to love? Whose responsibility is it to reach out and to help people who are struggling, broken, confused, baffled, battered, tangled, miserable, wandering sheep? Who has the social authority? Whose charge is it to reach out in love to a broken world? And the church has always said that's our charge. Both diaconally and ministries of mercy and ministries of the word are to meet and address the sin and misery of this world. We'd expect a competition. And thirdly, who can make it right? The question of pragmatic authority. Who can back up their claims of power? Who can actually make a difference in the lives of people? We'd expect that there would be a certain butting of heads that would take place here. Let me throw in one other comment here before switching gears. Many times we think of the social roles of the mental health professions as though those were always so, as though what it means to be a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a social worker is something that just has always been. But these are things that have radically transmuted themselves over the course of the 20th century. They are not givens. The whole notion that there's a mental health profession that does pastoral type work, that makes pronouncements about the human condition, that is a relatively new development. 100 years ago, a psychiatrist did no therapy, did no pastoral work. A psychiatrist was in the first place an administrator. A psychiatrist ran a big institution, and his main responsibilities were to provide safety, 3 square meals a day, a beautiful environment out in the country. All these Byberry or Norristown, these were all country back then. There were places where people could work in the fields, the birds would sing, the sun was shining, and people would basically fallen apart, would have a chance to, in a sense, get their hands dirty, be in a nice environment, get freedom from the stresses of life, and get their lives back together. Essentially, they were administrators who were meant to provide a good milieu. In the second place, they were medical doctors. So if there were some distinctive medical component going on, the insanities tied to alcoholism or syphilis, or if there were brain tumors that could be discovered, there's essentially at least a medical diagnosis, conceivably some kind of alleviating treatment. It was only subsequent to Freud's first visit in the early 1900s that the psychotherapeutic role started to become attached to that administrative medical role. Psychiatrists, the meaning of the word is often switched, and in fact, to this day, these terms have an ambiguity. Psychiatrists over the last 20 years have actually retreated more back to their more medical, somatic, biological homeland, you might call it, as many other practitioners, psychologists, social workers, pastoral counselors have given them flack and questioned their domination of the therapeutic, the pastoral counseling world. So these terms are fluid. A social worker What was a social worker? 100 years ago, a social worker was a charity worker. A social worker went into neighborhoods and helped establish that there was pure milk so that babies wouldn't be poisoned. She helped nursing mothers, helped with prenatal care, helped with community conditions, helped battle injustice, helped with tenement conditions. A social worker was essentially oriented towards those good works, more a helps ministry. The notion of a counseling role for a social worker did not come to the 1920s. And in the 1920s, there started a great controversy within social work. It actually continues to this day, where social work institutions, usually they opt for one or the other emphasis. Sometimes they have both. But it's very clear. Some are more community organizing, community work, job placement, housing conditions, and then this more psychotherapeutic role. Continues to be a tension even within the field. A psychologist, 100 years ago, a psychologist did nothing remotely connected to psychotherapy, remotely connected to counseling. A psychologist was a scientist. Basically, is a physiologist, physiological research. So looking at things like the reflex arc, you poke your finger with a pin and how does the electrical impulse travel so that you pull it back. Those are the kinds of things. It was a biological psychology that was experimental psychology that was essentially at the heart of the psychologist's role. World War I, the role started to broaden, and psychologists took on a testing role. The military was, 4 million people drafted into the army. How can we make sure we get the round pegs in the round holes and not into the square holes? And so with all the influence of intelligence testing, placement testing, aptitude testing, that expanded the role. It was really not until post-World War II that psychologists became clinical psychologists, became psychotherapists, became those who did much counseling. These things are not givens. They're things that have a history, they have a historical moment. And in fact, in the best analyses of that, the advance of the mental health professions into psychotherapy bears this inverse relationship with what the church has done, and with the weakness. As those things have advanced, it's been correlated to weaknesses in the church in its face-to-face pastoral care. And one of the things that I'm convinced of is that we as Christians have a wealth of what it means to do face-to-face ministry that really understands people, digs into their lives patiently, helpfully, with love, with truth. We have a wealth there that has been barely tapped. That's point one. On the surface, a competitor. Point two, dark side, the church has been intellectually derivative, structurally subordinate, practically weak. Now you see that each of those, in terms of the question of truth, the church has tended to subordinate itself and view that we must learn things from Adler, from Freud, from Skinner, from Rogers, from Jung. They have the big truth. They're the people that really know people. We are subordinate. We defer to them intellectually. The church has been structurally subordinate. The church in many cases has been reduced to being a source of referrals, a source of, okay, the church is fine for holding hands and someone's grieving, you can kind of be along with them, but anything more serious, the church's role is to refer to the professionals who really know what they are doing, structurally subordinate. And practically weak. The church's practical theology and face-to-face ministry has typically been pitiful, would probably be the best word. That at one end tending to be superficial, moralistic, just say no, have your quiet time, go to church, all your problems will go away. At the other end, a kind of spiritual quick fix. Have the mountaintop experience with Jesus, let go and let God, cast out the demon of anger, and in one dramatic act, all your problems will be solved. All of the things in the middle, all the really heart-searching, how do we know ourselves, what's true about people, how do you love people, how do you climb into their lives, how do you work patiently with them, those sorts of things have tended to be seized by the other professions, and the church has been in a very second-rate position. I'll give you a couple of quotations from a sociologist of the professions who analyzed the way the church receded as the mental health profession seized ground. A man named Andrew Abbott, he's cited later. He's talking about the late 19th century. Clergy analysis remained primitive. The gradual recognition of personal problems as legitimate categories of professional work did not bring a serious clergy effort to conceptualize them. The clergy's failure to provide any academic foundation for their practice with personal problems ultimately proved their undoing. If another profession should establish relevant diagnostic and therapeutic systems and legitimate these in terms of general values, the clergy's simple-minded cultural jurisdiction would be easily usurped. In the period after 1880, that's exactly what happened. And then Abbott goes on to analyze it that by the 1920s, he talks about the clergy as the losers, and that by the 1920s they had lost any vestige of real cultural authority over personal problems. The church was not seen as those who had the deep, searching answers. The church was, you might say, squeezed out to these fringes of pietism and moralism. Just a striking quotation here from Abbott as he's talking about the 20s. There emerged in this period the clinical pastoral education movement, a pastoral training movement aiming to give young clergymen direct experience with the newly defined personal problems. And get this sentence. Seminarians would learn the rudiments of human nature from psychiatrists, psychologists, and social workers who, and this is Abbott's quotes, who, quote, knew those rudiments. That is, from the professionals who currently controlled the definitions of them. Now see what he's saying there is that there were claims made that were able to be sustained, and the church bought it, the culture bought it. The people who knew human nature were the mental health professions. And the church now had to go to secularists to find out the rudiments of human nature. Very striking analysis of our historical situation. That next, one of the ways I've thought about this would be to say that we lost our heartland. The heartland when it came to people. The heartland of people and the reality of what's going on with people and how do you help people and how do you understand them and let's get our hands dirty with real life, real people, real problems. That heartland became the province of essentially secular professions. And the church was squeezed out to the margins. And the heartland are these things, I list a slew of them over the page, that page and onto the next one. The issue of say, self-deception. Who talked about that? Well, Freud talked about that. Anna Freud talked about it. Defense mechanisms. It's just the people who really studied what ultimately, biblically, is the deceitfulness of sin. Yet the profound analyses of that phenomenon, all retooled to fit in a different worldview, not done by Christians. The impact of our situations, traumas, suffering, being sinned against, abuse, the more sort of the way life can come at you with a knife on it, with a knife. The more subtle things, social shaping, the influence of models, sociocultural conditioning. These are things the Bible is about. And this is just bedrock biblical stuff. We're talking about the influence of the world. We're talking about enemies, about oppressors, about being sinned against. The real detailed looking at those things taken by other people. Motives. Why do people do what they do? How do we take apart their belief system, their cravings, their fears? What makes people tick? Their identity, the workings of the conscience. Again, these are the themes and the issues that have become essentially the province of different people besides the church. The notion of progressive change, interpersonal conflict, child rearing, communication, addictive behaviors, all the negative emotions, grief or guilt or anxiety or depression, anger, fear, aging, death, dying. These are things that Scripture is about, aren't they? But these are the things that have become the province of mental health professions where the truth, the love, the power in all these issues, the people who really know what's going on, study it and explain it, the people who are mandated to love and care and help, the people who are seen to make a difference, again, not the church. And essentially, out at the margins of significant discourse, it seems to me that the church, on the one hand, is seen to be basically externalistic, and on the other hand, to be sort of mystically internalistic. Maybe I could call it superficially externalistic, mystically internalistic. And so the things that are associated with us as Bible-believing Christians, on the one hand would be just rationalistic, have good doctrine, or moralistic. Do this, do that, be good boys and girls, have your quiet time, everything's going to be okay. Volitionalistic, that by some just saying no act of willpower, somehow life's going to be better. And so the 20th century looks at human life and it says, this stuff doesn't work. The church is irrelevant. The church is essentially the shell of, sort of a Pharisaic shell, the real profound issues that are going on in the human soul. The people who are grappling with that are the psychologists. They're the ones who are thoughtful there. On the other hand, the church is seen as, in a sense, too internal. So a pietistic, a mountaintop, a let go, let God, a cast out a demon, some sort of pietistic quick fix to the human dilemma is seen as what the church has to offer. Now, I would say all the good stuff in the middle is what the Bible is actually about, isn't it? That the Bible itself is a sharp critic of these sorts of things. The Bible itself is a sharp critic of these sorts of things. This is not to say that within the heartland circle is true piety and true morals and true doctrine. But those things are woven, true piety and morals and doctrine are woven, the making of choices, spiritual experience, these things are woven into the realities of child rearing and your motives and what happened to you and what kind of world do you live in and what's the world doing as it comes at you and what about it, being drunks or being sex addicts or whatever it is, abusing food, being gluttons. This is the stuff that Scripture is fundamentally about. Now, it seems to me that our task as Christians is how do we reclaim the heartland? How do we reclaim and readdress these issues, the significant discourse about people, their problems, how to help them, how to love them, how to engage them, these sorts of things. I give you a couple of references there. The Andrew Abbott. By the way, some of these there's that book of readings that Brian waved has got these articles in it. If you're interested in further reading, brings us to the third point. Our historical moment has opportunities for us. There are opportunities for us, I think, to powerfully re-engage. And I'll talk about these from two angles. The first one being a more general cultural analysis, the second one more presuppositional. Just within the culture, I think that the psychotherapies are vulnerable to a thoughtful Christian critique for a number of reasons. One reason is that there has been a radical and increasing fragmentation in the 20th century psychologies as the 20th century has proceeded. So the claim that somehow this is truth, this is in the revelation of our day, this is science, this is the truth, that claim is increasingly unsupportable just empirically, where you get proliferating systems mutually contradicting each other. There is not such a thing as psychology. There are psychologies. And to the degree that there are psychologies, the truth claims are hard to sustain, aren't they? Psychologies that themselves have internecine warfare with each other, opposing. I can put Freud, Jung, Maslow, Skinner all in a row here, but each one of them sharply disagrees with all the others, and that very fact is something that has become more obvious as the century has unfolded. Another factor that opens up questions. There have been very sharp critiques of the mental health professions from historians and philosophers of science and medicine. So, for example, one of the profound themes that has received a lot of ink has been secular people concerned about the medicalization of problems of living, the medicalization of life, and what are the implications if crime or drunkenness or childhood dysfunctions and such, if those are seen as medical disorders and not as fundamentally moral issues. People that are thinking about the nature of justice, the nature of law, the nature of public morals, the nature of civil life are profoundly concerned about that medicalization of things that are behavioral types of things. Historians of science, two most influential over the last 30 years have been Thomas Kuhn and Karl Popper. Both these men profound analyses of the nature of science. Neither of them believed that psychology was a science. They believed that it was more akin to myth and to philosophy and to religion and to politics. And it was something that was intrinsically debatable because you were dealing with, frankly, worldview moral issues and had no claims in Kuhn and Popper's mentality to being science. I've given another citation there by a historian of medicine, Charles Rosenberg, probably the leading historian of medicine in the country at this point. Rosenberg, a secular Jew, a friend to psychiatry from a certain point of view, radical critique of psychiatry's legitimacy within the culture. He bases it on three things. He says, first of all, psychiatry as a medical specialty is in deep trouble because its claim to be, the good, the true, and the beautiful hinges on it being seen as a medical science. And yet right within medicine, many doctors are highly dubious. They view it more like witch doctors that somehow got in the camp of the hard sciences. So right within it's the place where it needs to be seen as medicine to be legitimate. It's under fire from its fellows. Second thing that Rosenberg points out is a very curious thing within psychiatry itself, that those aspects of psychiatry which are closest to medicine, the treating of end-stage AIDS patients and the psychoses that happen, the treating of brain tumors, the treating of Alzheimer's and dementias that can arise, those things that have the most clear physiological component within the profession are the lowest status. They're the lowest. They're the mental hospital stuff. They're the nursing home stuff. They're just their psychiatry is a caretaking profession, like it was in the 19th century. The things in psychiatry that are high status are, and these are Rosenberg's words. Much of our century's most influential psychiatric writing has consisted of general statements about the human condition. This is Freud, this is Jung, this is Maslow, this is Skinner. Essentially what he's saying is psychiatry as theology, psychiatry as public philosophy, psychiatry as the meaning of life, and that those claims are highly dubious. And so you've got a profession where the thing that most legitimates it, we are medical science, is looked down on. The thing that is the most attractive and alluring to be the arbiters of reality to a culture is the most debatable, because essentially they're competing with other religions, other worldviews. And then Rosenberg's third point is that within society at large, the mental health professions have been handed this vast turf, everything from child rearing to criminality, juvenile delinquency, as well as just the aches and pains of daily life, anxiety, worry, depression, anger, interpersonal conflict. And they just can't deliver. They can't deliver the answer, because what they're dealing with, as we look at it as Christians, is sin and misery, just the blackness of life on a planet that lives in the dark here. And Rosenberg talks about what he calls the embittering gap between expectation and performance. So the society expects psychiatry to provide the answers to juvenile delinquency, to provide the answers to being anxious or depressed or having no meaning in your life. And there's this embittering gap because it never quite delivers. Some historical comments, I think give us some fresh opportunities. I think we've also got an opportunity in that the biblical faith really can be articulated to retake the heartland. The things that are in the heartland are what biblical Christianity is about. And I'm convinced, and this is one of the real treats of working at Westminster, one of the whole treats of this community, is to be part of a project to seek essentially to do that. That human experience in the details is stuff that Scripture will address. And we have the opportunity to present a distinctively Christian alternative into the world that we live in. Now let's think about that, engaging our historical moment with the resources of a presuppositionally consistent Christianity. Let me jump in. Let me start at this by giving you a metaphor that I think captures some of the dilemma. And I play with that old parable about the 5 blind men and the elephant, which probably most of us have heard. And it's, this guy thinks it's a wall because he's on the side, and the guy that's got the trunk thinks it's a snake. No, it's a rope. The guy that's got the tail, and the one that's got the legs says it's a tree. I've got the tree trunk here, and the one that has the ear says no, it's a big leaf. That little parable has often been used to comment on the role of pre-commitments in our seeing, the role of presuppositions. The way I play with that little parable is to alter it in a couple of ways. Imagine that that the blind men aren't quite blind, but with a blind man they've got tunnel vision and severe astigmatism at the same time. And but there they are, and let's take the guy that's got the tree trunk. He is right up close. He cares about tree trunks. He's examining it. He's poking into it, and that what he does is produces this extremely learned treatise on the nature of tree bark and the bark beetles that inhabit that bark and bore into it and seem to cause the tree some distress. And a treatise on how when you stick a sharp object into the bark, red sap comes gushing out rhythmically for some reason. We can't quite figure out why it's rhythmical, but trees seem to have this red sap that comes out. And then he has a theory that explains why periodically the tree like up and moves. And that seems contradictory to what we know of trees, and yet it seems like the tree is moving. And you get this 300-page treatise that just analyzes in minute detail and talks about what kind of poultices you can put on to stop the sap flow, and what kind of things you can try what creams you can rub in the bark that can make the bark beetles die and stop bothering the tree so much. And you look at that from a Christian point of view, and here's where the plot thickens. Imagine that as Christians, we've stood 40 feet away from the elephant, and we're over here saying, it's an elephant, it's an elephant, it's an elephant, It's man in the image of God, sinners against the living God, redeemable in Christ, able to be transformed by the power of the Holy Spirit. But we never knew that the legs bled, We never knew anything about the bugs in the knees, there in the folds of the skin. We didn't even know that the skin had folds because we're in a sense so far away from the critter that we just haven't been in there getting our hands. We haven't cared to get in there and try to figure out, well, how do I help? How do I get my hands dirty? How do you really bring salve to this, the bleeding knees of this elephant? I think that captures something of the dilemma, because you look at that and you say, well, on the one hand, for me as a Christian, I'm incredibly challenged by that person who is swarming all over the beast there 40 paces away. And I never knew anything about, the liquid came out of the knees. I never knew anything about little bugs that were there. And yet at the same time you say, but it's nuts. It's so perceptive, it's so provocative, and it is totally wrong. And its perceptiveness and provocativeness challenges me, reproves me, forces me to go back and do my homework and do my digging theologically, forces me to go and be challenged to get involved in ministry. And yet the fact that it is so wrong makes me utterly upset. I mean, how can you say it's a tree? That's not sap, that's blood. That's not bark beetles, those are lice. That's not bark, that's skin. That's an elephant, it's not a tree. That dilemma, I think, captures something of of where we as Christians stand with relation to the social sciences. So on the one hand, and I hope this comes through, there's going to be in a Christian engagement with our times a radical critique of psychotherapeutic systems, psychological systems. They are wrong. And they're all committed to be wrong because they're committed, in every single one is committed to, in the last analysis, say, people are not sinners. People can be explained by, in some way or other, what happens to us. So whether it's a humanistic theory that would say, your needs were not met by primary caretakers, or whether it's a psychodynamic theory that would say, the trauma that you endured as a child has determined your life, or whether it's a behavioral theory that would say, you were somehow conditioned by sociocultural forces to be the kind of person you are. Or you could go on and say, whether it's a physiological theory that would say, basically, you can explain the problems of living by recourse to genetics, to physiology, neurophysiology, chemical imbalance, those sorts of things. In a sense, every one of them is committed to define people in a way where Christ, a Savior, will not be the answer. That's the noetic effects of sin that Van Til has so perceptively alerted us to see. Systems are not neutral. People are, if indeed real people are always doing something with God, and I create a system of interpretation which thinks I can rule God out from the get-go, I am committing myself to a fundamental and pervasive error right out of the starting gate. And yet, on the other hand, so there's a feistiness and a vigor and a critique that we as Christians bring to the culture. On the other hand, you can see that there's a kind of humility loop that we're put in, because there's a recognition we have failed. We have failed as a church, and the 20th century is a sad tale of the church's inability to grapple with reality. and to grapple with what's honestly going on with people, and to be willing to get in there, get hands dirty, and minister pastorally with patience and perceptiveness, and all too often the sense that people have had about what the Christian faith offers to the woes of mankind are these things, and rarely that there is a significant address to all that stuff in the middle. He's got about a 70-page section of that book that is one of the finest descriptions of total depravity that I've ever read. Now, Alfred Adler doesn't believe in total depravity. He doesn't believe in sin. But he takes apart things right down to like why people pick their noses. I mean, he's just getting into the dirt of life and just taking apart he's just looking at the tricks and the chaos and the self-centeredness and all this. And he cares about it. He describes things, he cares about them, but here's another one of these ways where Van Til's fundamental insight about the noetic effects of sin, the distorting, pervasive effect, these things are not just there hanging in space as good things, good nuggets, you might say, to plunder. Because what Adler or anyone else is describing and caring about is controlled by a grid. It's controlled by a framework. It's controlled by this person's presuppositions. And that effect, even on description, even on quote the data, quote the facts, there's at least 3 different things that are simultaneously going on in that. That interpretive grid, the worldview, and it's everything from his view of God, his view of human nature, what people ought to be like, thus your diagnostic of how they fall short, the view of how change takes place, all of those presuppositions tailor even what's seen out there in the world. Because that man sees trees, doesn't he? He sees bark, he sees beetles, he sees sap. And there's three verbs I think describe the effect of those presuppositions. One, and this is the most positive thing I think we can say about it, it has a magnifying effect. It is as though what that guy with tunnel vision and astigmatism does, it's almost like he's got a microscope glued to his eye. And so there are things where, as he looks closely into the knees of that elephant, there are things that person sees that nobody else may have ever seen before. Just phenomenal detail about human life. There's a magnifying effect. Simple example. If someone is committed to a theory that our problems are all caused by childhood trauma, they are going to just put the magnifying glass, the microscope on every single thing that ever happened to you in your past. And we'll just dig and dig and dig and dig and dig into any kind of traumatic, hurtful event. And there'll be reams of stuff that will come out about how people have been hurt or stepped on or abused or maligned or mistreated or lied to or led astray or whatever. But that's one thing. There's in a sense, the richness descriptively comes by that magnifying effect that a theory gives you. But the theory also has a blinkering effect. While it sees certain things, if you've got a microscope glued on your eye, there's lots of things you don't see. There's lots of things you miss. So, for example, this person with a theory of the determinative effect of childhood experience may see that this person who right now is anxious and depressed and angry and abuses food and sleeps around with people to try to get love, and they may see that there were all these terrible things that happened to that person, but what they're blinkered from is seeing that's person A, but they blinker out, here's person B, who had a very different upbringing, who had wonderful experiences, who was brought up, was treated well, was treated with kindness, was respected, was not mistreated in any significant manner, and yet that person has the same problems. That person also misuses food in some way. That person also has sexual and moral thoughts or actions. That person also has anger, anxiety. And so the blinkering means that you exclude things that would actually force you to revise your interpretation. And then there's person C, who was abused, mocked, betrayed, and they turned out good. How do you explain the Lord Jesus Christ on a theory that betrayal and abuse control your life, being lied about and so forth? That blinkering effect must rule out many other pieces of a comprehensive view of human life. Then the most ominous, the third one, is that there's also a pervasive distorting effect. And we already saw that in the very metaphor that I used, that here I'm writing this incredibly profound treatise with a wealth of observational detail, but it's all about trees, not elephants. There's a pervasive, there's a colored lens put on the end of that magnifying glass. So I see everything as rose, or everything as green, or everything as yellow. I don't see the color that things truly are. Pervasive distortions. The presuppositions control in a fundamental way the descriptive stuff, and then they control the implications, the psychotherapy or whatever other, the parenting, the psychotherapy, the parenting, the how you're supposed to resolve problems, whatever else is seen as that. That too is control, and the phrase that Jay Adams used is very very apropos here, that explanations are signposts for solutions. The way that I explain something will tell me what to do about it. So if my interpretive grid is that you with your anger problem have a demon of anger, well, what do you do about demons of anger? You cast out demons of anger. If I say that you with your anger problem have that your needs for love were not met in childhood, what do you do about that? Well, I try to meet your needs for love now. So I try to create a structure where we can reparent you and nourish you and, in a sense, fill up your love tank. If I think that your anger problem now is because you have certain cognitive distortions that distort the way you interpret your world, what will I do about it? Well, I will seek to change your cognitions, to change the way you interpret your world. If I think that the reason you do that you're angry is that you're an Aries with Jupiter rising and March is a bad month for Aries, I will tell you to lie low during times when your sign. The interpretive grid guides you for what kinds of answers, therapy, solutions you're going to propose. If I think that you are hardwired for aggression because human beings genetically and physiologically, hormonally, have an anger response to any kind of threat, then I will approach you from the either a standpoint of it's hopeless to change you, so let's just create cultural controls like prisons and that sort of thing, or I will approach you medically, say, let me find a drug which can calm you down and basically minister to you physiologically. The interpretive grid controls description, it controls implications, and it's that place where we as Christians have the opportunity to engage our culture's belief systems, because we can interact with the presuppositions, and we can engage in what I call it at the end, we can engage in the reinterpretive task. The reinterpretive task is basically looking here and taking apart that framework, that systematic understanding, and putting a different spin on it. So I'm able to play with our metaphor, to come and say, look, those things that you see about tree bark and about sap, they make better sense if you understand those things as elephants. And in fact, if you understand it as elephants, you can also explain these things that you never could explain in your theory, like why the sap, so-called, jets out rhythmically, and why the tree trunks up and move around every now and again. See, to understand the human being as an elephant, it's what turns inside out, upside down, reinterprets the whole way you see things. You've thought that if you had rotten parents, you're going to be a rotten person. Well, let's look at the fact that there are people who had rotten parents who turned out to be good people, and there are people who had very good parents who turned out to be rotten people. Let's play. Let's take the blinkers off. Let's take the distorting effect off. Let's in a certain sense appreciate the magnifying effect, and yet put a different paradigm, a different spin on what it is that you're seeing there. That kind of reinterpretive task I see is at the heart of the encounter, the apologetic encounter, ultimately the evangelistic encounter with people who have been psychologized. And we want to, I listed at the bottom of the page just a number of articles that you might find interesting to follow through on that. Those articles are, each of them in their own way, is meant to engage something that is hot in our culture, coming out of the pop psychologies or the more formal psychologies, and is seeking to put a different spin on it, making those facts, quote unquote, those the things that people describe, care about, putting it in a completely different world of a completely different intellectual system. Let me just I'll do this in closing here, a very small example of this, and pick the example of low self-esteem. Real typical scenario that would be described. Situation. Unpleasable parents. Okay? Reaction. Low self-esteem. And all the attendant behaviors and so forth. Jumping through hoops to try to get them to like me. Perhaps I'm sexually immoral, or maybe I use food in some very self-destructive way, somehow trying to get the sense of feeling good about myself, or get some sense of affirmation, wanting affirmation. These parents were capricious, they were manipulative, perhaps they were violent, perhaps they betrayed trust, and here I am just stuck in this mess of failure and guilt and trying to please these people, and never works, and acting out in all these different ways, and generally just unhappy and confused and a mess. So our culture looks at that and it says, well, low self-esteem is the problem. Let me try to create high self-esteem. Let me try to boost the person's self-esteem, give them a good sense of self-esteem. And so what gets introduced is a new situation prime, if you will. This situation is an all-pleasable therapist, where you might say the one cardinal rule of the psychotherapy is, I will accept you. In Carl Rogers' words, unconditional positive regard. Just a fundamental attitude of affirmation, validation. I'm for you, I don't judge you, I'm not going to try to change you, I just accept you. Just a warm, beaming kind of approach. And let's say one of the things going on with this in this person is that I only make $50,000 a year, and I'm an RN, and one of the things my parents wanted me, they wanted me to be an MD, and they wanted me to make $100,000. And one of the things sort of the value system, and I'm striving for that, and I never attained it. And one of the things that this all-pleasable therapist tells me is that, it's okay if you only make $50,000 and you're only a physician, an RN. That's okay, that's valid, you're yourself. And trust yourself, and affirm yourself, and be content with who you are. And so there's in a sense, there's a certain, I would call it a counterfeit of love, and there's a certain counterfeit of truth. And but it tends to, those things ring the bells of this person. And so as this person who's just been miserable and depressed and jumping through hoops and always trying to please people and full of social fears and anxieties and wondering if people like them, and always on tenterhooks, and perhaps snappish and easily angry and taking offense really easily, and always feeling like somebody's out to get them, maybe even a little bit paranoid, and all these things. Suddenly we're in a new situation, and that situation goes to work on me, and it tells me, you don't need to please your parents. You're valid as you are. You're basically okay as you are. You can accept yourself. I accept you. The other people in the support group accept you. You can see how that, as that works on the person, you're going to see symptomatic relief take place in the person's life. The person is going to feel better. The person is perhaps going to be less compulsive about food or sex. The person is going to develop some sense of contentment. Maybe they start to become less jumpy about whether they're going to be accepted. They become more confident, a little more, increased self-confidence that in social situations, less easily angry, a little less anxious. We look at that and we say, well, many people find this extremely plausible. It's an extremely plausible apologetic for then, let's be Rogerians. Let's give people love and give them realistic standards to attain, and that's all they need. Very plausible apologetic that gets made back towards us and gets made towards the culture at large. what do we as Christians do as we look at this? Well, some of our fundamental categories tell us, for example, that yes, we live in situations. Those situations have, value systems in them, and the world is seeking to shape us, and there are ways we are sinned against by others. And then our system also tells us that our reactions, our behavior and emotions come from somewhere. And biblically we're given vast treasures for understanding human motives in a God-centered fashion. So for example, we might say about this person that there is a theme in this person's life the Bible would call the fear of man, that is basically, I crave my parents' approval. And if I can't get theirs, I'll try to get it from someone else. If I have to sleep with them to get it, I'll do it. Or if I can't get it, I'll just stuff food in my mouth to fill the void. Or there's something that I crave their approval. I'm oriented towards what those people think of me. And it never works because I'm living to please them, and they're unpleasable, and I'm a wreck. I'm a nervous wreck there. And I've got these, something maybe the Bible would put in the category of pride. I'm seeking to define in some way success or righteousness or something which is going to make my life worthwhile. And I think that if I'm a doctor and I make $100,000 a year, I'm a success. I've made it. I'm serving this impossible standard. And if I can't be that, I'm a failure. Well, from a biblical point of view, these reactions make perfect sense, not as products of a rotten situation, but as existing at the interaction between a situation with its stresses and a heart that engages that situation and produces all this stuff. These things come out of a heart, ruled by fear of man, ruled by pride. Then here's where our analysis gets very radical. We then look at the supposed therapeutic success here, and we say, you know what? I can grant you a certain symptomatic relief, but you know what? It is absolutely unchanged at the level of motive. This person is still a man-fearer. They still live in terms of human approval. All that has happened is that they have changed the object of who they're looking to. So instead of looking to unpleasable parents, and hence being a nervous wreck, I now look to an all-pleasable therapist or an all-pleasable support group. Well, no wonder I feel better. You might say that my idolatry has been rehabilitated. My idolatry, which made my life miserable, it now works for me. And now I'm going to go through my life, and I'm going to look for nourishing people. And I'm going to avoid some of these, this kind of people. I'm going to look for these kind of people. I feel better about myself. Spend less time doing destructive behaviors. I spend less time comparing myself. And also, this pride and defining myself in terms of my accomplishments, well, I've now rejigged the standards, so now I've made those to be attainable. So now I really do think, if I'm an RN and I do a good job in that and I make $50,000 a year, I'm okay. That's a fine kind of person to be. We look at this biblically and we say, this person has just been tricked. At the deepest analysis, they feel better, but where in this equation is the true transformation of their life? For example, are these things even goals worthy of a biblical person? Where is love? Where is joy? Where is gratitude? Where is obedience? Where's the willingness to sacrifice? Where's the courage to actually love your enemies in ways that are both merciful and yet tough-minded? Where's all the good stuff about what human life is meant to be in Jesus' image? This is not the image of Christ. Feel better about yourself, kind of content, I'm okay, growing self-confidence. This is a pitiful standard to aim for, isn't it? There's much higher things to aim for, and in fact, these things come where someone's heart has been renewed. And if the fear of man that lays a snare is replaced with he who trusts the Lord is safe, and if pride is replaced with humility that makes it our aim to please him, it gets a whole new set of goals that is reoriented by the gospel. This is a person that has a new heart. This is a person that has new values. This is a person that has new priorities. This is a person who has a new God. And what has essentially happened, even in successful quote-unquote psychotherapy, is the rehabilitation of the old gods, not the giving of a new God, who is the one living and true God. See, we as Christians can come at, and this is just one tiny throwaway 10-minute example of the kind of thing that it seems to me we as Christians can come at our world, look at what it's looking at, look at all the details, all these details about how this person feels and thinks and acts and how sex fits in and food and anger and anxiety and escapism and about the parents. And we're also looking at the supposed solutions. We take that apart in just as much detail, and we just throw this paradigm spin on it. We turn it upside down, inside out, backwards. We reinterpret it in a radical fashion. My experience has been this sort of thing just carries the freight. We deal with psychologized people all the time. Probably few of them actually are psychologists. The writers of books or the teachers. Most of them are just people that sit next to you in church. People that are worried about the fact that they've got low self-esteem, or they're worried about the fact that they've got a sexual addiction, or they're worried about the fact they can't control food. And people who often drink in the psychobabble of our age. These are people we can reach. And in giving a better, deeper, richer interpretation, we have the potential to both edify the church, bring about ongoing conversion of the richness and wisdom of the church, as well as opportunities to then challenge the secular world, engage it, and do the same thing. Throw the paradigm shift at them that makes sense of the very things that they see and care about. They call it bark, we call it skin. They call it sap, we call it blood. Right on down the line, and we have a more radical analysis of the problem, because it's a problem between you and God, and a wonderful solution because we have a Savior who bore the wrath of God on our behalf, and who gives the Holy Spirit to change us. All in a nutshell. Obviously, there's much we can pick out. Physiological things are really valid area to explore and push. I think that there's going to be a big difference, just as looking at cultural experiences. The fact, what's it like to grow up in a materialistic culture? More sociological analyses. There's many areas that are valid areas to explore, as long as we don't adopt them as our fundamental explanatory paradigm. And even with someone who has severe physiological problems, that person is still in the image of God, and that person is still facing moral issues, which they can grapple with. That person, even with Alzheimer's, does not need to just be mean and nasty, and never be challenged about repentance and seeking forgiveness, that sort of thing. So we want to be interested in physiological factors, and yet we don't want to grant them a controlling status over the moral responses of the human being. Physiological things would be part of the situation, and physiological issues, even if it's just something as simple as allergies, or PMS, or where your hormones are off, or physiological issues always bring at least three. There's three kinds of quote spiritual issues that come to play. One, how do I react to the temptations created by that? If I get allergies every August, seasonal allergies, and I know that I'm more prone to be irritable during that time, does that mean the allergies cause the sins of irritability? And I'd say no, but they create conditions of temptation where if I'm going to sin by irritability, it's a whole lot easier to come out. How is it that the person reacts to their particular physiological constraints? Second one is, conceivably, the physiological problem is a product of spiritual sorts of issues. There's many physical problems are ultimately psychosomatic. You talk to any doctor, what do they say, 60 to 75% of what a GP sees are psychosomatic. What's he saying by that? He's basically saying these are issues that are in that heartland of where a person's anxiety or anger or bitterness or immorality or guilt is causing a physiological problem. And the third thing that often happens is a physiological problem. Many times it can put you on the shelf in a sense and make you get more honest about, well, where am I? It may have nothing to do with the illness per se, but the illness gives you a chance to reflect more widely on what am I living for? Are there sins in my life? Are there things that I don't have time to stop and think about? So we want to be maximally interested in physiological issues and yet not finally buy into a paradigm which makes them determinative of what are fundamentally moral covenantal responses. That's an awfully big question to ask in a little 1-hour talk, but there's actually a whole course here at Westminster on physiology taught by Ed Welch that would deal in a lot of depth with that. My nutshell answer is there may well be I'd have no problem at all if there were some genetic component, say tied to manic depression, But here's how I'd come at it, and then say, all that would mean is that if that person is going to crack up, they're going to crack up by going on cycles high and low. Whereas if I crack up, it may be by becoming depressed. And I don't think I'll ever be manic in my entire life. I was just hatched mellow. But I can tend to be brooding or turn inward and that kind of thing. There may be some physiological thing. I was always that way. I came out of my mother's womb not very excitable, more mellow and sort of slightly on the down end. There may be something genetic and all that. But here's one of the things that really, one of those defining moments for me. I've known a lot of, I worked as I said, in a psychiatric hospital for a number of years. I've known a lot of manic depressives, and I've known more since I've been a biblical counselor. Their manic episodes happen not in a vacuum, like a bolt out of the blue. They happen in response to life situations, typically, 9 out of 10. Maybe there's some rare one where it's purely physiological, but I remember that after I was converted and got involved in biblical counseling, the very first manic depressive that I ever counseled, he was classic, textbook case, and he'd had 3 manic episodes in his life, and then 3 big crashes afterwards. And listen to these set of facts. The first manic episode was 1 week after he was married. The second one was 1 week after the birth of his first child. And the third one was 1 week after the birth of his second child. Now you look at that and you say, this is not the same thing as a true disease, is it? There's some situational component going on here. And what was so clear, just in getting to know him, again, granted whatever physiological predispositions there are, this was a guy that was highly controlling and loved his pleasure and hassle-free life. His cravings, the lusts of his flesh, were all oriented towards, I want to control my world and have no hassles. Well, wives and babies really rock your agenda. And this guy had cracked up 3 times, and he was psycho. And yet, it's not as though he was by that, even by whatever physiological thing may be proved to have been there, it's not as though that was somehow excluded from him as a moral responder who has a way that he interprets life which is godless and is fundamentally serving the flesh. I think the other defining moment for me, again, early on in my counseling career, was paranoid schizophrenic, fruity as the day is long. He walked, and he was tricked to come see me. He didn't want to be there. He finally agreed that he'd talk to me for an hour, and so I violated every rule of counseling because I figured, okay, I've got an hour. I'm going to have to stake everything on one roll of the dice. So what I basically decided in my mind was, I'll let him talk for half an hour and just get to know him, and then I'm going to go for everything all at once. And so I let him talk for half an hour, just interact, ask questions, and he was crazy. He thought that the radio was, Cat Stevens was writing songs about him, and that there were people out to get him, and the FBI was trailing him, and there were people at work that were in a conspiracy against him, and he thought that he was a kind of messiah figure who had been given a great revelation by God. He was supposed to be the new Martin Luther, and nobody appreciated it, and everybody was trying to sabotage him, and the guy was crazed. He's good old classic paranoid schizophrenic. So he's babbling away, and about halfway in I think, okay, so I stopped him. I said, "Do you mind if I give you some feedback?" I said, "Sure." He's still a human being. You can talk to crazy people. They're just people. Do you mind if I give you some feedback? And here's, in a nutshell what I said. I've known a lot of paranoid schizophrenics in my life. It helps to have, because I have. It's one of the advantages of all this life experience. I've known a lot of paranoid schizophrenics. And there's 2 things I've seen in every one. 2 main problems. One, they're incredibly grandiose. They're the center of the world. Everything hinges on them. And 2, they're terrified. Because if you have to be the center of the world, and the world doesn't play ball, they're all out to get you. And I just probably spent 3 or 4 minutes just talking about what is paranoia after all. It's grandiosity and terror. It's something that, is that such an unusual sin? It's not really. Every one of us is like that. It's the nature of sin, in fact, to be self-exalting and terrified, hiding and self-exaltation. So he is extreme in the degree of his symptoms, but he has not become another kind of creature from me or you. No temptation has overtaken us. It's not common to all. So I talked about that for a while, and then I said, The only hope is if there's someone who can help you from outside your system. Because your own system is so airtight and it's so destructive. You need help from the outside. And I pulled Isaiah 53:6. All we like sheep have gone astray. We've turned each to our own way. I drew that back to what we've just been speaking of about his life. And then the second half, the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. And there is a Savior who is big enough for people who are just trapped in their grandiosity and their terror, and share the gospel with him. Well, that probably took 7 or 8 minutes. Now, this is a guy that has been crazy for a half hour. He's been in a mental hospital and brought from it by his family. You know what his next words were? That's really interesting. Can you tell me more about it? We had a conversation as normal as you or I, for the next hour, and just talked about the implications of what his sin was, and who Christ was, and how it worked, and what it led to. Then, the craziness was gone. Now, why? I don't know totally. Is there a physiological thing that lies behind, quote, paranoid schizophrenia? I don't know, maybe. But is what he's doing grandiose and full of terror and full of lies? Yes, it is. That means I, as a Christian, can interact with him about real issues. And by the grace of God, obviously we don't make anybody ever listen to us. By the grace of God, this guy had ears to hear. And it led to a number of months of counseling and discipleship, and finally, he's coming from a distance, finally getting him plugged back into his local church. The guy proved to be something very different from what it looked on the surface. So, those kinds of things have been, they've really, those experiences early on just gave such confidence that the biblical analysis of human life cuts deep. It's not trite, it's not pet answers, it's not simplistic. It cuts deep into the real issues in people. And then that sort of thing also started to feed back, even in thinking back on my pre-Christian experience when I was working in the mental hospital. And I realized things like, our hospital took a medical model in theory of mental illness. But in reality, once you got people in a floor, in a small group, in psychotherapy, it took a moral model. Because a medical model is ultimately completely depressing. And you cannot have 25 patients and 10 staff members live together if there's not a moral structure. And so people would be dealt with as morally responsible. And so if you hit people, you got in trouble. And if you cursed and said crazy things, you got rebuked. And if there's an inconsistency even in those who would try to implement a medical model, because human beings are moral. And any system of psychotherapy is moral. It's giving people a worldview. It's trying to change how they think, how they react, what they want, how they behave, how they choose. And another thing that dawned on me reflecting back was, I can remember the absolutely craziest people that I ever knew. And there's this one guy, Stuart, that would just literally pace like hour after hour, just swinging his hands and babbling and and shouting periodically, and just nonsense. And yet, every so often, you could like get through to him. And I can remember a couple of times having conversations with this man, again, very normal conversations. And then a nurse would come in and say, "Stuart, it's time for you to get ready to go to your job." And he'd start to babble. Or, "Stuart, your parents are coming to visit you." And he'd go nuts. He'd start to babble. And just as I pieced it together and what I knew of him, this is a guy who hates his parents. He's got bitterness at them. He's angry. Now, are those, medical issues? No, those are moral issues. And he's a guy who is profoundly lazy, who really wants to cop out on life, and he's copped out on everything his whole life. And he has used, right from the time he was a little child, anytime he didn't want to do anything or life was hard, he would do weird things. And so here's a guy who's 25 years old. He's a lunatic. And yet, there are moments that reveal that lunacy is in some fundamental way connected to what are moral issues. Very common things that I can identify with, of lassitude, bitterness, escapism, and so forth. Yeah, my response, and again, we could talk at depth, and so it's a quick response, but I think we as Christians can say much more than it's wrong, it's of the devil, it stinks, it's heresy, and that there may be a certain limited value in just being purely polemical. But ultimately, if you're purely polemical, it's preaching to the choir. And you're going to create a fortress mentality of, in a sense, the elect who are insulating themselves from all the ugly things out there in the world. Whereas I think if we're actually to reach our world, both the Christians who buy into psychology as well as the non-Christians, we have to have some kind of more assertive, positive methodology, a reinterpretive agenda that goes at life and turns it upside down and inside out. So something of that reinterpretive task I see is real needed, else we become sort of fortress mentality, separatistic, self-righteous, triumphalistic. Second thing, on the other side, the bowing down. Sometimes that it can almost be hysterical. I can remember one time talking to a man and his wife. It was myself and two other elders, and this man was really mistreating his family. He was stubborn. He was angry, irritable, irascible, easily provoked, very selfish. And one of the elders was really taking him to task, very lovingly but straightforward, just calling him for what he was. And the guy was just sitting there like a lump. The wife was there, and she seemed half asleep, I can remember being a little bit curious. Like, I would think she'd be really engaged here, because here the elder's doing her dirty work for her, trying to take her husband to task. She's half asleep. Finally, the elder, getting no response, he made a comment. He said, your life is just such a dysfunctional life. He used the D word. This is like late 80s. So that woman, it was like she got an electric jolt. She sat up and she went, "Could you say more about what you mean about my husband's dysfunctional?" I practically jumped out the window at that point, because the word dysfunctional just means it doesn't work. Here for 20 minutes, the elder's been laying out in detail how it doesn't work, and yet suddenly the word dysfunctional got used. I was like, "Ooh!" Suddenly a really meaningful word has come on the stage here. Now we're talking about now we're talking deep, in reality. So if our car mechanic, if you took your car in, and he looks under the hood and comes back and he shakes his head, "Man, you got a dysfunctional engine." Say, "Well, I know it's dysfunctional. That's why I brought it in. But what's wrong with it? Is it the carburetor? Is it the radiator? What is it?" "Well, it's a dysfunctional engine." You go see another mechanic, because you want details, and the Bible gives us details on what's wrong. Now, how you help those people? Some of it is going to be just long-term patient ministry, public ministry, teaching ministry. It just basically seeks to help people think in a biblical world, debunk the stereotypes, let's help people not get the pat answer, doctrinalistic, moralistic, pietistic, demonistic, debunking that stuff, whether it's the illustrations, the applications. Let's say more in application, just have your quiet time, or give it to Jesus. Nothing wrong with having your quiet time, give it to Jesus, right? There's true piety, and true morals, but the preaching can give people a different worldview, teaching, recommending good books, and then ultimately I think this whole reinterpretive task can simply make more sense for people than the bogus wares that the world offers. I can remember many occasions with counselees who've come in. Maybe they have a Manurth Meyer book in their purse, and it was basically just rejigging the secular stuff with a mild gloss of Scripture occasionally. And yet, if this person's a Christian, they're going to thrive on the truth. I've just seen so many people come in, and they walk in, they're thinking purely psychologically. Basically, they're a victim. Their needs weren't met, and just by good engagement with them, teaching that's timely and hits the need, an hour later they're leaving, realizing, I'd always thought of it as this empty love tank that I needed love somehow, and my parents didn't give it to me. I never thought about it that, I actually walk around through life craving people's approval. And that has these profound, like Psalm and Proverbs 29:25, the fear of man, living for what people think of you, it does lay a snare. And I understand the snares I get into, and I see how my anxiety or my approaching a new situation, kind of looking out of the lattice, like what are they going to think of me? And and I walk into that college and career group, and I'm comparing myself to people, and I'm wondering what people think of me, and all that waste of energy that's growing out of my lust for people to like me. And I see how the gospel engages that. Oftentimes, that kind of just what's really basic teaching, biblically, it's like the dimmer switch going on in a dark room, and life just makes a whole lot more sense.